webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, June 4th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition publicly demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower that came down on 9/11, a 47-story skyscraper that drops like a rock symmetrically, smoothly into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. All this in the afternoon of 9/11. So we got a lot to learn today. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of our 9/11 Freefall radio show, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You can submit them in the questions and information form that's online at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education and find the live webinars. There's a box there. I'll also be monitoring the YouTube broadcast of this and the broadcast on our Facebook page for any good questions or comments related to the material that Richard will be going over today. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, though, before launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And so let's get into it. A lot of people didn't even know about Building 7. We go all around the country talking to engineers and architects at their conferences, and most are completely unaware of the third worst structural failure in modern history. I kid you not. This should be the most studied building failure ever. After all, it wasn't hit by an airplane, right? So if you didn't know about it, you're going to learn a lot. If you did know about it, we're going to brush up on the technical details so that you can share the information with others. Here's a 47-story skyscraper, easily the tallest building in most of our states. It'd be the architect of record, Emery Roth and Sons, structural engineer Erwin Cantor, the developer Larry Silverstein. We'll get into him in a bit. It's part of the World Trade Center complex here in the northern part, and wasn't hit by an airplane. So it's a real important case study in structural failure. It was the third skyscraper to collapse. It's about 110 yards away from the North Tower. And it was hit by some of the laterally flying structural sections that were ejected out of the North Tower and started some fires, as you see, or as you will see. But here, the building is standing fine after the collapse of the towers all afternoon. So let's take a look at what happened to it here. The east penthouse falls first, and about 6 seconds later, the entire rest of the structure collapses. So we're going to be digging into this quite a bit today. So let's go to Shyam Sunder, the co-project leader of the NIST report, and see what the official story is here.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fires? What fires? These fires, burning here at 2:30 p.m. on the east side of the building, burning here, same side of the building, and around the corner on the north side there, and over here also on the north side. So these fires are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. And they progressed, by 2:30 or 3 p.m. 3 p.m. they're moving away from the area associated with the initiation of collapse by NIST, under the east penthouse, because it collapsed first. They focused their collapse initiation theory there around column 79. So they develop a fire simulation, which shows us that the fires at 2 p.m. were on the south side, which is facing the north tower, the twin tower. But then they move around toward column 79 for the last 2 hours of the life of this building. Well, is that true? It can't be true, because NIST admitted itself that fires don't persist in any one area for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. In a modern high-rise building, that's all the fuel there is to burn. So they move on looking for fresh new fuel sources. As the photographs show, in fact, by 3:50 p.m., those fires are well beyond that area on the 12th or 13th floor, which is the focus of NIST's collapse initiation theory. So we did our own fire simulation theory, and we note that the fire started, like NIST suggested, at 2 p.m., but it moved on. About 3 p.m., it's around column 79, and it's clear by 4 p.m., having moved toward the west. And in fact, on the floor, it's completely burnt out by 5 p.m. That's what the photographs and videos show. And that's completely not consistent with the NIST fire simulation theory or their claims of massive fires in that area during the collapse. So that's just the beginning of the problems here for NIST. Let's see some of the others.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Okay, so fires for the first time have caused a progressive collapse.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining columns.
So this is their computer model, which they spent 6 years trying to refine. And it essentially debunks their own theory, and we'll get to that. But what is their theory? That these long span beams are 50 feet long in the fire were expanding just prior to the collapse due to the fire, which they say is burning at the time of the collapse. Well, we saw that those fires had burned out already, but they couldn't have expanded anyway because they're fireproofed. So we're halfway through the application of the fireproofing here. And we have 2-hour fire protection here, much longer fire protection than fires ever burned in this building. So they couldn't have been expanding. But let's say they did expand. And this says they pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79. Here's the girder. Here's the seat. Here's column 79. Whoops. Here's column 79. So that girder, though, could not have been pushed off of its seat because it would have had to have been pushed all the way off of that seat, 12 inches, in order for it to fall off. Well, NIST says, well, actually, it only had to be pushed halfway off. And then the flange folded once the eye of the I-beam, which is the web of this beam, cleared the seat. So it only had to be pushed off about 6 inches. Well, in order to make that call, they had to omit key structural components like these 3/4 inch stiffeners shown here in plan view and shown here in elevation view. They were there. They're on the shop drawings. So NIST omits them, citing that they were only there to prevent web crippling, so they didn't model them. Well, they would have also prevented that flange from folding at the bottom of that massive girder. NIST also says that this girder got pushed anyway off of its seat. Well, it couldn't have been pushed off of its seat because there's 30 shear studs shown also on the shop drawings, which NIST somehow denies weren't there. So it's a real problem for NIST. Also, they were there. And so this girder couldn't have just slid independently of the concrete slab up above because those shear studs tie that girder to the slab, and they were shown on the drawings. So this is clearly a fraud on the part of NIST. But let's go further.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
And so let's just say that all that could have happened, that the girder could have been pushed off the seat, and that it didn't have to be pushed off 12 inches, but only 6 inches, and it fell. Well, there's two other massive girders framed into this column. So they would have held that floor up. But NIST somehow says, well, they all gave way too. But let's say that could have happened. And floor 13 fell on floor 12. And with what force would it have fallen? Well, it would have fallen with about 60,000 pounds of impact force. But that's 10 times less than what would be required to break the girder's connections on the floor below, because they're framed exactly like the girder up above, as you see here. So it would have taken 632,000 pounds to break that connection. But let's say that could have happened, and the connections were broken, and floor 13 fell on 12, broke those connections, and on for 9 floors. Well, if that were the case, we would have had, NIST says, a massive caving in over that 9 floors, and that instability traveled all the way up to the east penthouse, which is why it starts to fall, and all the way down to the floor. Well, if you had such a massive set of structural failures on the east side of this building, you would have seen incredible deformation of the exterior structural steel frame. It would have crumpled up like a beer can, telegraphed to the outside of the building, which we didn't see in the photos or videos of this building's collapse. We would have had massive breaking up of granite panels and windows by the thousands. We didn't see that either. Here's NIST's computer animation.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Well, somehow the entire east side is collapsing in on itself. And what do we see here? The breaking up of 400 structural steel connections per second, like firing a hose on a sandcastle. And of course, they only model the east side, so we don't even know how that propagation of failures might have extended over to the west side, and they stop it after 2 seconds. Let's look at it compared to the real video and see if it does match quite well, as Sham Sunder says. The east penthouse matches, but from there on, it's a complete divorce. There's no breaking up of granite panels, windows on a massive scale, only about a dozen windows or so in the actual video of the collapse. And their computer animation stops after just 2 seconds. Why? They had 5 years to perfect this. Well, it begins to tip over, as any collapse beginning lower in the building would be expected to do. But the video of the actual collapse betrays that theory of NIST. Something else is going on here, which we'll be looking at. So they simply stop their computer animation after 2 seconds. So we provide a request for correction, as well as a Freedom of Information Act request for them to release the computer input data. Their response, denied. We can't release this to you. It might jeopardize public safety. What? Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the public, and the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? If this building came down due to fires, since there are similarly designed, hundreds of similarly designed buildings that also come down due to fires, at free fall acceleration, as we'll get into, we need to know exactly what NIST did so that we can duplicate those results and update the structural codes so that future buildings and present buildings are safe. But none of the structural codes in the International Building Code were updated as a result of the recommendations that were made by NIST. The International Conference of Building Officials knows that its building codes are safe. So we use the scientific method here at AE 911 Truth. What is it? We've had it in the West for 100 years or so. It's how we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction, myth from reality. So what do? We have a formula. We have a question. How did the tower come down? Building 7, we do some background research. How have other towers come down? Make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the tower came down. After it's an educated guess. And so we make predictions based on that hypothesis. If that's true, what else would be true? We lay out all the hypotheses that make sense given the data that we have. We don't focus in on any one of them due to our financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter. So fire is certainly a possibility. Controlled demolition, as you'll see today, is a very high possibility. Well, we test those hypotheses with predictions with experiments after making predictions, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we do. We report the results then in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data from architects and engineers and scientists, citing that it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this valuable data that we keep in our black box. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and construct a new hypothesis that stands a better chance against the experiments, the observations, the research, the results, and the conclusions, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by all the above. So with that in mind, let's proceed and do some background research and find out how have other high-rise buildings come down. Well, not due to fire, but say in a wood frame building, a fire being an organic, chaotic process burns through an area, in about 20 minutes or so. looking for fresh new combustibles. So NIST acknowledges that fires don't persist in any one area for more than 20 or 30 minutes, even though they claimed that in Building 7, they persisted for more than 2 hours in a particular area around column 79. So in a wood frame building, though, we would expect certainly some damage, and so they tend to fall over, though, to the path of least resistance after the fire burns out a structure asymmetrically, because this is a chaotic process. It doesn't just burn, or the collapse doesn't happen straight down through the tons of cold, hard structure below the fire. So what happens in a steel frame building? Well, we have the largest test of its kind by British Steel in the UK. An 8-story building was set on fire, made out of steel, some of it fireproofed, some of it not. They found some astounding results in this fire. Let's take a look.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse primarily due to fire. Why don't steel frames collapse, even when they're not fireproofed, as we see here? The connections don't fail. The beams can sag, but they typically don't fail beyond the sag. Well, let's look and see why that might be true, because there's dozens of examples to choose from here.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No collapses before 9/11 due to fires in steel frame high-rise buildings. How about after 9/11? Not in the Grenfell Tower on June 14th and 17, and not in the Abco Tower just last month in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, nor in Jakarta in 2016. The only steel frame building that did collapse wasn't fireproofed and was an experimental building in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. So that's not apples to apples at all. Natural collapses, in this case earthquakes, these buildings did come down due to natural causes. But we see a building at the base of the collapse that looks like a building. It's certainly mangled, badly damaged. But the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we'll see in all three World Trade Center skyscrapers. So set these examples on the shelf, because we'll be comparing Building 7 as we go here. Now, these buildings were blown up. They certainly suffered incredible force in these explosions, and due to the incredible heat from the explosive chemical reactions, we have thick billowing smoke that's expanding in cauliflower-shaped form rapidly away from the source of the heat, with a very solid edge that's expanding, with witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. We also have pulverized debris from the buildings. We'll be looking for that in Building 7. But let's look to controlled demolition, because explosives can be used quite effectively to bring down high rises, as you see a number of examples here. We have dozens and dozens of examples all around the world. There's only a handful of companies that can actually perform this. How do they do it? They set shaped cutter charges at the columns and beams in the building and take out the structure within seconds, starting in the interior first and working themselves out in less than a second, usually to the exterior. So when we have a controlled demolition, we have a very common set of features that are easily associated with controlled demolition, such as a sudden onset of destruction. Is not gradual. It doesn't, like a natural collapse would be. Usually it's at the base of the structure. So there's a straight down, if that's what they want to accomplish, they can engineer it that way, a symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint to avoid damage to adjacent structures. That's because there's a patterned removal of column supports, synchronistically timed floor by floor, resulting in a freefall acceleration or near freefall acceleration, straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel that's been holding up the building for its life. And then that results in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, something natural collapses don't do, as we saw. Resulting also in limited damage to adjacent structures. Ideally, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And there's a patterned set of explosions heard by witnesses, seen by them. Broken up concrete floors. You don't want to have to go into this controlled demolition and manually jackhammer those floors up at all odd angles. Let the explosives do that work. So the floor is shattered. Explosive charges, therefore, are left behind in the residue. We have evidence of them. And so chemical evidence of those devices, but also with regard to feature number 8, explosive charges going off in the building, isolated explosive ejections called squibs, obviously explosives going off, which leaves behind chemical residue. So we look for those, and that is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of it can be is attributable by fire, let alone all of it. So if you have all these features, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, that can be very helpful, foreknowledge of the destruction, by workers and engineers and so forth. Experts agreeing, yeah, that was a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts without financial or political obligations, which might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether something's a controlled demolition or not. And video documentation, of course, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. Now, we're going to apply that model of proof at this time to building 7 and see if we have these features. Let's begin with, is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the building? Well, let's listen to Dan Rather as we watch this additional video of Building 7's collapse at 5:20.
Are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? What did you say, Dan? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, that's exactly what it looks like. We've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas that come down due to controlled demolition. And as we'll see, there's no difference. So Dan Rather is just using his intuition here to describe what he was seeing. The problem is we never heard him talk about that ever again after 9/11. In fact, we have not seen the collapse of this building on mainstream television since 9/11, even though it should have been the most widely seen and studied collapse. Because again, no plane hit this building. So what's causing this collapse? Things aren't adding up. How about feature number 2? Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's go to the west side. And yeah, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Notice the main penthouse and screen wall here. The east penthouse on the left side has already collapsed 6 seconds earlier. But we're now watching a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building, the main penthouse and screen wall collapse. Well, what are they sitting over? They're sitting over the core columns of the building. Well, NIST told us that this development traveled laterally across the building from left to right, in this case, which is east to west. But they all fail. Those columns must have failed all together at once in order for the the main penthouse and screen wall to fail all at once a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building. This video completely pulls the rug out from NIST's theory all by itself, because NIST theory states that it went from left to right. So we have the building falling into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint. So yeah, it's pretty straight down and pretty symmetrical in this nice haystack pile, only 4 stories tall. But I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's take a look. Building 7 on the left, a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition with explosives, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11? Should it not have been the first hypothesis, if not the only one, that NIST came up with? The one that makes the most sense, but no. It was relegated, that hypothesis, to a frequently asked questions published 8 years after 9/11. Very frequently asked questions. Why did World Trade Center 7 collapse? while no other known building in history has collapsed due to fires. Did the investigators consider explosions? Well, NIST brushes that aside, saying they concluded that blast events inside the building did not even occur, and yet we'll be showing you evidence that they did, and found no evidence supporting existence of a blast event. And we have all kinds of evidence that we're going to talk about today that refutes that. They also suggest the smallest blast capable of failing the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. Well, guess what? There's other ways to bring down buildings other than controlled demolition with high energy explosives, which provide extremely loud blasts. We'll see the evidence for that as well. So, and yet we're led to believe by NIST that these small scattered fires brought this building down. Well, how do you bring a building symmetrically down? Not if it's not for those small scattered fires that we just saw. Because what has to happen here to bring a building symmetrically down is the instant removal of all the columns in the building at once. And as you will see, this has been proven by the University of Alaska in their 4-year study on the subject, which I'll show you too. Does fire have that capability to remove the core columns and then within a second later, the exterior columns? These fires. Think about it. How fast is this building coming down? This is pretty important. Let's listen to David Chandler, physics teacher.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to freefall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Zero resistance, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Well, guess what? NIST was publicly embarrassed into acknowledging the free fall of this building as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky for a third of its 7-second collapse, because members of AE 911 Truth were there at the conference. They called them on it. They finally admitted it and actually published it in their report, but they don't acknowledge the implications of that. The implications are that if it fell at free fall, then the columns didn't buckle. Something else happened to them. They were removed instantly. How does that happen? We'll talk about that in some more detail. If columns are going to buckle, they're going to provide resistance. Even after they bend substantially, as you see on the left side here, they continue to provide up to 25% of their capable resistance during the plastic phase of their deformation, meaning it would never achieve free fall. They're not like a plastic straw that putting pressure on it bends and then has no residual strength. So NIST completely ignores this. So we go further. Do we have feature number 5? The total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. Yeah, here we have a 47-story skyscraper. Moment resisting structural steel frame where the columns and the beams are rigidly welded one to the other so they don't do this. Columns, beams. And yet they're collapsing like a house of cards into a pile about 6 stories tall. How can that even happen? We'd expect a 20-story pile that wouldn't even look like pancakes. We'd expect it to tip over, not to come straight down, like buildings that collapse due to natural causes, like earthquakes in this case. Do we have limited damage to adjacent structures? Feature number 6, fairly limited damage, yeah. There's some damage to the post office in the Verizon building, but it's minimal. Feature number 7, sounds of explosions heard by credible witnesses. Let's first go to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used to collapse in Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not reported on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
No? Well, let's take another look here and see if that's actually true.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caved out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the worst part.
Wow. A shock wave ripping through the building, a sound of a clap of thunder, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. How about this witness?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
This is Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, who was on site with Building 7, as was this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you could just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
So a big flash. And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, didn't realize that Building 7 had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. They're making their way into the building to the emergency center on the 23rd floor. But they got there and found it empty, so they were told to get out of there. And this is their experience on the way back down.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion, blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs. Bombs like this heard in the late morning of 9/11 by these credible witnesses?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Yeah, those firefighters are not hearing the sound of one floor hitting another, which is what NIST is telling us those explosions were. Well, there's another witness, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which is 20 miles north of Manhattan, which detected seismic waves near the time of the collapse. So the official narrative tells us that these were produced by the collapse. But there's a problem with the official narrative. First of all, the signals occur at 5:20 and 42 seconds. But the start of the collapse doesn't happen for 10 seconds after that. So how could the collapse of the building cause the signals? Well, NIST has an answer for this. They say the seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of collapse is likely due to the falling of debris from inside the building. Well, wait a minute. We already saw that the debris, this one going to go? Yeah. That the east penthouse falls 6 seconds earlier, and there's no indication below it that there's any other collapse until now, when the whole thing comes down at once. That central section, as we talked about, comes down only a half a second prior, the main penthouse and screen wall here, only half a second prior. So there's no indication of a massive collapse. Otherwise, we see incredible deformation of the exterior perimeter structural steel system, because those columns and beams inside are so rigidly tied to the outside, of course. Well, let's go to Andre Rousseau, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. What does he say? The seismic data, he says, it has a bell-like form. It points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris, especially spread out over many seconds, according to the NIST theory, 30 seconds or so. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. So that's his conclusion. So we move on to feature number 8, the pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. What? Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigations says look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. So this would be something different than high energy explosions. What are we getting at here? Well, as seen from every direction racing away from the collapse of Building 7, just like in the Twin Towers, actually, 35 miles an hour, these rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes of expanding gases in this solidly defined edge by this rapid expansion is an indication of incredible heat source fueling it. What could that be? This is only our first look at this. It's not these small scattered fires that we see in Building 7 prior to the collapse. Surely those would have been extinguished in the collapse itself. We're talking about something on the order of this, an incredible heat source. Let's look further at feature number 9, molten steel and iron. What are we talking about here? Well, documented by NASA's infrared sensitive cameras, thermal imaging, documenting incredible temperatures on the surface of this building's collapse of 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, there's no fire on the surface. The fire was surely put out by the collapse of the building. So what's burning here? Something deeper down in the pile that's much hotter than these temperatures, that when it rises to the surface, it actually is cooling down to 1340 degrees. Let's look deeper. Here's Abulhassan Astani Azal, who was a professor at Berkeley's structural engineering department, and he had unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill, at least before they took the steel away from him while he was looking at it. But what does he say?
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center. Well, wait a minute. Girders don't melt at fire temperatures, normal office fire temperatures, of which 1340 degrees is one of the hottest office fires that occur. Normally they're around 500 or 600 degrees. So what can melt steel girders? We're talking over 2,800 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, prompting the author of the FEMA report, Jonathan Barnett, who says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, it takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. That cannot possibly be accounted for by office fires. We're talking 4 times the temperatures created, at least 4 times in modern office fires. So we go to a FEMA Appendix C, produced by FEMA for Building 7 and the Twin Towers. The Appendix C produces in their May of 2002 Building Performance Assessment Report a limited metallurgical examination. So this should be revealing. What do they observe? Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like we see here in this piece of Building 7 steel. How can that possibly happen due to fires? Office fires, not even jet fuel, melt steel. And remember, no plane hit this building. We have rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Attack, hot corrosion attack on the steel. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST. In fact, it was removed in the NIST report when NIST took over this investigation in 2002 from FEMA and then produced their report 4 years later. What do they say? Well, we couldn't test. There's no steel recovered. Again and again and again and again and again. No steel recovered from Building 7. But we just saw the actual piece of steel provided to FEMA by John Gross, the co-project leader of the NIST report, who's here photographed with that very piece of steel that they documented and found liquid molten iron, hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel that's capable of doing this. His shadow is all over the evidence. Well, what can account for this? I mean, hydrocarbons, which are building and even jet fuel, only produce 600 to 1400 degree temperatures, more typically 500. Yet steel had definitely melted during the event, as we see here in the material pouring out of the debris held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator. We have the physics tells us the temperature of liquid molten materials like this. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees. Liquid molten iron, white hot even, pouring out of there. How can it be accounted for? So what caused it to melt? Let's look for something that can. How about thermite? That's a possibility, because thermite produces these characteristics, as you'll see. Could it have produced this? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Hey, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the incredible heat. It produces 4,000 degree as its byproduct. And what does it produce? It produces liquid molten iron at those temperatures. And we'll see plenty of evidence for liquid molten iron coming up. It would also produce sulfur, because sulfur is added. It would account for the sulfur that they found, that FEMA found in Appendix C. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So this is absolutely extraordinary. But is there evidence for it? Well, did NIST investigate for such things? He said, no, they didn't, as you'll see. But others did. And Stephen Jones, professor, says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or magnesium. NIST found that no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. Did you look? A year later, they acknowledged in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residues. Wait a minute. You can't find what you're not looking for or won't look for. Others did, though, and it wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, nuclear physicist, is sent some material from the ends of the beam provided to him by the sculptor of this, one of these many sculptures that were done throughout the United States and around the world. One of the first things that Stephen notices is that you don't have this crazy jagged pattern in the ends of the steel beams produced by the iron workers at the site cutting the steel beams. They produce very efficient lines with their oxyacetylene torches and thermal lances, not these crazy zigzags. So there's something else going on here. So he does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis on the slag from the end of the beam from the International Peace Park. What does he find? Manganese shouldn't be there. Aluminum shouldn't be there. Sulfur shouldn't be there. And lots of iron shouldn't be there. Elemental iron, not steel as an alloy. We'll get to that. What does the U.S. Geological Survey find in their particle atlas study of dozens and dozens and dozens of samples all over Lower Manhattan of this powder produced from the destruction of the World Trade Center? They published this publicly in 2005. They find billions of these previously molten iron microspheres. Well, they don't know where they came from because this was certainly previously molten, so exceeding 2,800 degree temperatures Fahrenheit. They're round, so they were formed during the event. They're spherical, and they're iron, so they're not melted steel. This is really curious. There's up to 7% of the World Trade Center dust samples are composed of these previously molten iron microspheres, amounting to up to 4 tons by extrapolation from how many they find in the actual samples. 4 tons of this material altogether. 150 times the background level of iron particles in dust, which you can get in background dust, as you see here in this sample. But it's not spherical. So something else is going on here. R.J. Lee finds that these are formed during the event, not before, by the construction workers welding, not afterwards, after 9/11, by the iron workers cutting the steel torches, but during the event. So they're so ubiquitous that they're used by the EPA as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. Well, how would they even get in the dust? What's one possibility? Well, here's a controlled experiment using thermite. Under controlled conditions, we see here, slowing it down halfway, thousands of sparks. Well, those aren't really sparks. Those are liquid molten iron spheres that cool and fall as spheres in the dust. Why does that happen? Well, aerosolized liquids form themselves by surface tension into these extremely small droplets, magnified here. So that can account for the process. If thermite were used under explosive conditions, that liquid molten iron would be aerosolized, and it would fall on the tops of and the ground, on the tops of these cars, toasting them. Perhaps that's a reasonable explanation as to the toasting of the tops of these cars in this extremely high heat event at the World Trade Center. What other rational explanation is there in this high heat, extreme heat event? Well, you can make shaped cutter charges out of thermite in your own backyard, as civil engineer John Cole did. And this is what you get. And here's the process. So the explosions are heard, but they're actually muted, and they can cut through steel beams, as you see here. Well, there are devices that are much more sophisticated than John Cole's backyard experiment. They're patented devices that are shaped cutter charges that issue molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds through structural steel, much thicker sections of structural steel than high energy explosives like C4 and RDX can penetrate. So perhaps that's one of the reasons that thermite cutter charges were used here. And we'll be showing you the evidence of this. But why wouldn't they use C4 or RDX, traditional high energy explosives? Why else might they not use that? Well, they provide an extremely loud audio signature, a loud bang, and a visual signature, an extremely bright flash, sets of them. So maybe they wanted to avoid that by going to something more that would have less evidence. In fact, there are devices that were patented prior to 9/11 whose casings themselves are made out of consolidated consumable thermite, which would be consumed and leaving only molten iron as the byproduct. Well, pools of molten iron are discovered throughout the World Trade Center, as we'll see in next week's episode 2 of this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. But what else was found in all this World Trade Center dust? A team of scientists led by Niels Harrit and in Copenhagen collected 7 samples from around the World Trade Center of this dust, including a sample from across the street from the World Trade Center 2 in Jeanette McKinley's apartment. She collected it. She was an artist. She paid for that decision with her life later as she was working with this dust in sculptures, part of her own therapy for having been traumatized when her windows blew in from the tremendous explosive force of the South Tower. And she succumbed to brain cancer years later. Very tragic. But her sample is provided to Stephen Jones is one of these samples of the 4 samples that were documented in the peer-reviewed study. Up to 10 tons of this material was estimated to be in all the World Trade Center dust by extrapolating the amount found in the dust samples that they collected. These huge quantities of this. It's red on one side, gray on the other, dual layered red-gray chips. And it's attracted by a magnet. So they get very curious and zoom into the red layer, study it with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, finding what? Aluminum, iron. The signature of unignited thermite. Thermite's made of aluminum and iron particles, iron oxide particles, basically rust and aluminum, finely mixed. And here with silicon, oxygen, and carbon. We'll come back to that. So they get even more curious, zoom into the red layer 50,000 times and find what? Nano-sized particles of 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Particles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets that are set, the ingredients of thermite, set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material. Organic material is used in the explosive TNT. It's what causes the expansion of those gases. Well, here it is used as the matrix for these other incendiary materials. So we appear to have something that's engineered to become more explosive and incendiary, which works by means of heat, massive heat, 4,000 degree temperatures, to become even more explosive. The documented literature shows us that their samples in exothermic reactions produce 420 degree Celsius, 758 or so temperatures Fahrenheit. They react. Well, here in these traces collected by the international team, find that they do the exact same thing. They ignite. What happens when they ignite? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those 4 tons of molten iron microspheres came from. There's no question. They came from these dual layered red-gray chips because they have no other source that FEMA or NIST or anybody else has fingered as a possible suspect that makes any sense. So you see, we have a self-corroborating, repeatable set of experimental data, experimentally provable data that could put a lot of people, the real perpetrators, away for a long time for mass murder and treason, which is where this evidence is heading. As if we didn't know where these spheres came from. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. You see, when we make nanoparticles like this, the surface volume increases exponentially as the size of these particles decreases. So you have instantaneous reactions. So an incendiary has been engineered to become more explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's an extremely sophisticated process made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So they conclude in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, in this 25-page peer-reviewed paper, that the red layer of the red-gray chips is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's highly energetic, pyrotechnic, or explosive material. So NIST has been proven wrong for the 24th time. There is evidence of explosives or incendiaries. More likely incendiaries in this case of Building 7. So features 1 through 10 have been shown as direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. The fires have caused less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations, and they fall to the path of least resistance or over. So why don't we have steel frame buildings collapsing due to fires? Well, steel conducts that heat away from its source. So it never gets to the 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature where steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Typically doesn't happen. But to keep that from becoming a problem, we fireproof the beams with 2-hour fire protection on the beams, 3 hours on the columns. Remember, that keeps the building safe from fires which can persist in one area for only 20 to 30 minutes, even as acknowledged by NIST. We also keep the tenants from bringing, or the contractors from building out of combustible materials. So we don't build high rises out of wood, for instance. And we also sprinkler these buildings to keep all of that from becoming a problem ever. In the case of Building 7, we're told that the sprinkler system was the sprinkler main serving the building was damaged by the collapse of the Twin Towers. We don't argue that point, although it could be argued. So what about these official investigations from FEMA 2002 with $600,000 of funding? That our efforts were hampered. According to the New York Times, they didn't have access to the building. They didn't have access to the steel. They didn't have access to the blueprints of the buildings. This is absolutely ridiculous. And the steel was gone before they could properly examine it, as we'll see. In 2008, NIST produced their own report throughout that Appendix C metallurgical examination. and all of the valid evidence there of the hot temperature corrosion attack on the steel, while admitting, truthfully, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Yeah. And again, throwing out this report documenting silver dollar size holes that normal office fires can't produce in Building 7 steel. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue of this building's collapse. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, we have in easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, the destruction and removal of evidence at 400 truckloads a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, Bill Manning, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, of course, which is why we have structural folks like controlled demolition expert from Europe crying out after being first shown the collapse of this building live and filmed live in real time, telling us his experience, one of the top European controlled demolitions experts, his opinion about what he's looking at here.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Het is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft het team gedaan van experts.
Wow. It doesn't get more clear than this. Of course, the experts in the United States rely on the federal government for most of their high-rise controlled demolition contracts. So they're not in a position to provide an objective opinion in the matter of whether these three buildings, focusing today on Building 7, is a controlled demolition. But not outside the US, where we have Hugo Bachmann, chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering at Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, demanding a new investigation, like Kamal Obeid. Localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and pattern loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does fire do that? And like the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, who for the last 4 years has been studying the collapse of this building and who has issued its final report on this building, which you can find on our website at ae911truth.org, who studied it with 2 different software programs, finding, first of all, that there's a big problem here. No other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. Completely failed. And so it's essential, they say, to ensure the public safety, that the failure mechanism for this building be understood. Well, how could it be understood easily if NIST withheld their computer input data? But we had enough data to do an independent analysis here, finite element analysis. So they examine the response to the fire loads using NIST's fire loads. They rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse. And the science behind the study, also their third approach, identify the types of failures in locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. Well, they use all the same data that we had available to us from NIST. And the methodology using these three approaches were to simulate the local structural responses to fire loading for floors 13 and below, as NIST did. Examine the NIST collapse initiation hypotheses with that data, and simulate numerous failure scenarios that could have led to the total collapse as we observed on 9/11. So they modeled the building first in AutoCAD and then Abacus, and then they model it also in SAP 2000. And using the same scenario, the collapse initiation scenario NIST used that we discussed earlier, they find that some startling conclusions that completely reverse the collapse scenario of NIST's. First of all, they found that NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. They made it infinitely stiff, which forced the expansion to the inside, as NIST claims, moving that girder off of its seat 6 inches. Well, the movement of the seat was in the opposite direction when it's adequately and non-fraudulently modeled by an independent team. NIST's erroneous assumptions were that the shear connections on several beams were broken, was proven not true. They assumed no shear studs, as we discussed, but they were there. The bolts fastening girder to its seat were not broken in the actual modeling that University of Alaska at Fairbanks did. And that in approach 3 using SAP 2000, they found that column 79 didn't fail, and neither did 79, 80, and 81 fail. But if they could have failed, the building would have tipped over. It wouldn't have come straight down as NIST claims. It would have tipped like this, as you see in the UAF modeling. But the video doesn't show that. The video of the actual building's collapse shows something else, as I'll show you. So they conclude the collapse of Building 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns, but a global failure, as you see here, which does in fact match the videos. The building does collapse straight down when you take out the columns. Well, let's go in order. Fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7. Temperature was not high enough in the fire temperatures to cause the weakening of the steel structure, which is consistent with previous high-rise fires behavior. Thermal expansion did not result in the loss of support for the beams and girders. World Trade Center 7 did not experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building during over an 8-story stretch, leading to the actual comparison here. Oh, well, we're going to make this video go. Where you see these three the one on the left, the computer model of Building 7 comes down, as you already saw, in the exact fashion of the video of Building 7, symmetrically straight down into its own footprint, whereas, as we already saw, NIST's model begins to tip over. They stop it after 2 seconds because it begins to tip over, and it looks nothing like the actual collapse. So I keep thinking we can get this video to show you, but not so. There we go. Yeah, here you go. So on the left, UAF model, on the right, NIST model. Which one looks more like the video in the middle? So NIST has completely pulled the rug out, the UAF, University of Alaska, has completely pulled the rug out from underneath NIST in their theory that this building came down due to fire. And we're getting this out now to all of the universities and affiliations of structural engineers and architects all around the country now, and to Congress people too, to get a real investigation. Foreknowledge of the building's destruction. Well, yeah, this anonymous engineer is consulted by Chief Hayden. If we allow it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? Well, never before have we had the collapse of an office building due to fire, and all of a sudden they consult this engineer who says there's structural damage from the beams that hit the building from the World Trade Center. And yeah, in its current state, you have about 5 hours, he confidently declares. Wait a minute, who's this structural engineer? We don't know. Chief Hayden will not release the name of the structural engineer who predicted this collapse almost to the minute. Okay. Of course, this prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge of the building's collapse. What other foreknowledge do we have evidence of? How about these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Blue flame, debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? How do they know the building is about to blow up? It has a few small scattered fires throughout the building. And no other building is blown up due to office fires. Well, what about Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, who is seen, along with others, pulled back 6 blocks away from Building 7 behind the yellow tape? They're told it had structural damage and that it could come down. Well, he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. And this is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off and you heard 3, 2, 1.
3, 2, 1. Do buildings come down due to countdowns? What is going on here? Let's fix this green screen. Hold on 1 second. See if we can go back. And no. So for the remainder of our presentation, we'll do without the green screen. There. Well, this is getting really interesting here because evidence, now our computer's locked up. Andy, are you hearing me? Wait, it just unlocked. Let's see if we can go forward. Yeah. We're able to go forward now. I thought my computer froze there for a second. We also have the BBC announcing the collapse of Building 7 20 minutes before it happened. This is absolutely extraordinary because no steel frame high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire. And here they actually announced it before it happened. Well, they apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What, does this make them psychic? What's going on here? Take a look.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. Actually, even sketchier is the announcement of the collapse of this building at 11:07 that morning by Alan Dodds Frank. Take a look.
In New York, Alan Dodds Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke, like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabia and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Wow. No other 50-story building went down. No other building went down. There were buildings that were damaged, but they are not near 50 stories. So he's talking about Building 7. If Building 7 had gone down at this time, we wouldn't have any videos of it because it would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud released when the Twin Towers collapsed. So many 9/11 researchers suggest, have concluded that the building was supposed to go down at that time. Under the cover of this incredible dust cloud from the Twin Towers. Well, what other insights can we draw? How about from Larry Silverstein himself, interviewed a year after 9/11 on PBS, who declares this about his experience of managing Building 7 during 9/11.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull. And then we watched the building collapse.
Wait a minute. We made the decision to pull. They made the decision to pull. And then we watched the building collapse. Well, he says later, from an understandable outcry from the public, what? The NIST told us this building came down by fire, and you're saying you pulled it? Well, pulling it is a term used in the controlled demolition industry. You don't pull a building in the afternoon, especially while it's on fire. You don't send people in there to pull a building. He says, I meant pull the firefighters out of the building, not pull the building. Oh, yeah? Well, FEMA reports that the firefighters made the decision early on not to even attempt to fight the fires, due in part to the damage to World Trade Center 7 from the collapsing towers. No manual firefighting operations were taken by the FDNY. We're told again and again by FEMA and Sham Sunder from NIST. So let's put it all together here. The scientific method shows us that the hypothesis of fire or the hypothesis of controlled demolition is indicated. You have to make that decision. I've made my decision. 1 million 9/11 truth advocates have made that decision, and several million others around the world see the features of controlled demolition satisfied by this evidence, features 1 through 10, and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition as well, as you've seen, of course, the incendiaries. This is not direct evidence in destruction of destruction by fire. It's direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse. Again, they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, we find that this is direct proof of controlled demolition. So we want to leave you with that and ask you, is that proof for you? Because, gosh, it doesn't matter what we think. We want to educate the public and the professions and the media and the government. So you might have some questions and we want to answer them. Let me turn you over to Andy Steele, who can share with you how best to do just that.
All right, everybody, please submit your questions that you might have in the input form I talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education and find the live webinars. The box is right there. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you are informed, you agree that this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Pretty awesome. While you're there, by the way, subscribe to our email newsletter. We send out every couple of weeks an email on latest evidence we have, the latest efforts progress we're making toward a real investigation, things you can do in your local community, all kinds of actions. In fact, I think Andy will be talking about some of those, but it just takes 2 minutes to subscribe. Get informed also on our website. We have an incredible evidence section about Building 7, more videos, more documents, and on the Twin Towers too, the subject of our forthcoming part 2 and 3 in this series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. And sign the petition while you're there. Even if you're not one of our 3,000 architects and engineers, there are more than 20,000 others supporting them. So be sure to sign the petition and support those architects and engineers who are taking a stand, risking their reputations on speaking out for the truth. And donate, support us. We are all over the country in conferences around the world, sending all kinds of information, like 75,000 postcards to engineers all around the world, showing them the results of our study, the 4-year study by the University of Alaska, for instance. We never stop doing what we do. And we're the tip of the spear of the 9/11 Truth movement. So we have to be funded. We actually have 6 employees. It doesn't all happen by accident. It doesn't happen by corporate or government funding, I can assure you. We do not get those. It happens through thousands of us supporting each other on our website substantially. You can also send in a check. And we're looking for some real checks to support real projects right now. You can also become a member of AE 9/11 Truth. Join the family of sustaining supporters. And if you can't do that for whatever reason, be sure to volunteer and support us. Andy, what are some of the opportunities we have?
Absolutely. We've got a phone team doing that outreach, calling people, and we're going to be getting them back to work as the country opens up. We have a verifications team right now who, I mean, all those people that fill out that petition, they got to be vetted and checked to keep the petition honest and pure, and that takes a lot of effort from those people. They're very well trained. We got a translations team, a great leader there, data collection team, finding out who or where rather these people that we are doing this outreach to are located. We have writers. I mean, so many things that you can do, and we can come up with new ideas all the time. First step, though, is to decide that you want to work. So you go to ae911truth.org. On there, there's a volunteer form, a very short one. and fill it out. We'll get in touch with you. And you mentioned project due diligence that Roland Engel is doing. That's a big one too for our engineer volunteers. So there's plenty of things that you can do. The key though is to decide you're going to do it. And I think we need this information to come out now more than ever. So please help out.
Right on. Thanks so much, Andy. And there's things you can do, at home. Maybe you're not a team player. You like to just work on your own. You can contact your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know. Show them the DVDs. Share them. You can get them on our website in our store. Share the brochures. You can get the brochures 100 for $10 and pass them out. Just talk to people one-on-one. Send out the final report from the University of Alaska to every engineer and architect in your community. Ask their opinion. Give them to your elected representatives. Tell them that we've got legislation now that has been created. Andy, how does this work?
Okay, this is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. You can see there it's the path to justice for the nearly 3,000 victims who died that day. Bobby McIlvaine died that day from an explosion as he was entering the North Tower lobby. And of course, that's not part of the official story. So right there, by the nature of how he died, we have an instant opening when we talk to our members of Congress. And of course, it's named after him. His father, Bob, has worked with us for a number of years, a big advocate for a new investigation. And what this would do is would establish a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress that would do exactly what we've asked Congress to do all this time. Look into the evidence that Richard has pointed out. And it's actually written in such a way that they have to look into the possibility of nanothermite being used to bring these towers down. So this is draft legislation. We got to find a heroic congressman or congresswoman out there willing to introduce it. And we're constantly talking to them and bringing up this information. But we need your help because we're just a couple of guys from Berkeley here. And if we don't, unless you're talking about the congressman who oversees that, they want to hear from voters, people who put them in power. So that is why we need you to participate in actions such as the constant outreach that we're doing with setting up meetings over the phone. Government's still operating and they're taking meetings over the phone right now. And you can do that and get involved. If you have any questions on how to do that, just write to me at congress@ae911truth.org. You can also go to ae911truth.org/justice, learn all about the Bobby McIlvaine Act. You can download a packet that has the act in there for outreach to congressmen when you see them live. You can also put in your address and zip code and all of that. And if you don't have time to write a whole letter, it'll generate a letter for you that you could forward to your representative. So there's so many ways to get involved behind this. And, when you want something from government, you got to offer them the solution. The solution is the Bobby McIlvaine Act. So please get behind it.
Right on. And you can get behind the grand jury investigation project also. We've already got the letter from the U.S. attorney in Manhattan that says, hey, you've given us 60 exhibits of this evidence. It looks real. We're going to comply with the law requiring us to give it to a special grand jury. That is underway. And we filed a mandamus action to force them to prove that it is underway. So stand by for that, as well as the results of our appeal on the judge's ruling on the FBI lawsuit, because the FBI has our evidence too. And yet they didn't give it to Congress when Congress required them by law to show them all the evidence that they've got since the 9/11 Commission report came out. So stand by there too, and stand by for the massive results expected from Christopher Gioia of the a local city in New York, who, along with all the other four fire commissioners, unanimously voted for a new investigation of Building 7 and the Twin Towers based on the evidence that you've seen here and that you'll see in part 2 and 3 also. So extraordinary things are happening. And stand by, because he says you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York state is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. They fully support a comprehensive federal grand jury investigation and prosecution of every crime related to the attacks of September 11th. Now, as if all that's not enough, we have created a hour-and-a-half long documentary with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. It's really good. I want to give you just a couple of minute taste of it right here, and then we'll answer your questions.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten.
What I saw was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined. Scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agenda.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And right on, it's not science. So we've been looking at the science, and you can find the science here in this 1-hour video. It is available in our store for, and it includes the Meet the Experts DVD along with it. You can also see it for free on YouTube, the 1 hour version. So you can download for free the Beyond Misinformation book, the PDF. And also you can get the hard or the soft cover, put on your coffee table, 50-page book on this subject. It is available for like $10 in that version. And we have the 2 hour version of this presentation, and it covers all 3 skyscrapers in our store and for free on YouTube as well. And also the 15-minute PBS documentary narrated by Ed Asner is available just on Building 7, this one. So some people don't have a lot of time. Give them this one. Start them off easy with Building 7. In just 15 minutes, they'll get a summary of what you saw today. And you can also get the DVD in our store. But maybe we have some questions at this time, Andy.
Yes, we have 4 questions. The first one asks, in the questions and answers to NIST on Building 7, NIST says it almost looks like a symmetrical uniform collapse. However, in a video, Shyam Sunder seems to contradict this by saying the symmetry of Building 7 rules out controlled demolition because demolitions are brought down in a wave where one side falls before the rest of the building falls. Is this a contradiction?
Well, yeah, here's another excellent question about the inherent contradictions in NIST. Now, I was unaware that Shyam Sunder said that demolitions are brought down in a wave where one side falls before the rest of the building falls. That is actually only true a small percentage of controlled demolitions when they want that to be true. More normally, the old hotels in Vegas, for instance, are brought down all at once, but it doesn't matter. They can do controlled demolitions any way they want, but it's more proof of a controlled demolition if you bring it straight down like Building 7 came down, because it's more common. So I'm actually shocked to see something, and surprised and pleased that kind of catches NIST with his pants down here. Andy, you want to add to that?
I think you've covered it. I think Shyam Sunder most of the time is just splashing water, trying to keep his head above it. So it doesn't surprise me at all. The next question says, in the frequently asked questions to NIST concerning Building 7, question 10 asks how it is even possible that fire can cause the symmetrical collapse seen in all the videos. First, NIST says the videos that were taken from the north did appear to show it fall almost uniformly as a single unit. Why does NIST say it was almost uniformly when you really can't get much more of a uniform collapse? And the NIST answer only mentioned how the interior collapsed asymmetrically. Why does NIST think by explaining the interior collapse that this answers the question of the exterior symmetrical collapse? I find it very disturbing when NIST gives answers to questions that were not asked and then dodges the questions that were asked. Any comments?
So these are great questions. And our goal is to take these questions, which strike at the root of the contradictions with NIST and the dodging, and publish them in an article with a short answer for each one from our perspective. Now, I can, but I won't. Maybe I will. Venture an answer on the part of NIST that they might answer with, speculate. NIST is caught between a huge rock and a hard place. They have no wiggle room here. All they can do is dodge and throw up red herrings. And that's what they're doing here in this case. The video shows a very, very, very symmetrical collapse. It almost couldn't get more symmetrical. Building, maybe they're using for their reason that it's not symmetrical the fact that the east penthouse came down 6 seconds before the rest of the building. Well, that's a joke, because the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, concluded that the only way that east penthouse could have come down is if it was an isolated event. In other words, it's not tied to the rest of the destruction in the building. There were columns that failed directly under the east penthouse for unknown reasons. You know, Professor Halsey and his team of PhD researchers at University of Alaska are not going to speculate what might have caused the east penthouse to fail. They're just documenting that it couldn't have fallen, as NIST claims, as a result of failure of columns down on floors 13. Otherwise, you would have seen the telegraphing of that all the way up the building, like NIST tried to prove in their computer model, but overdid it with the failure of 400 structural steel connections every second, which weren't then telegraphed to the outside. In their computer model they were, but not in the actual video of the collapse. So I'm really enjoying these questions. We also want tough questions for us. So I'm actually putting out the call to our audience to ask us tough questions. We don't want to just be, in a sense, these are softball questions. They make us think, but they're questions perhaps designed to make NIST look bad. Not that that's difficult. In fact, it's extremely easy to do. And I'm glad you're doing it because it makes the point. But throw some tough ones at us too. I know you have in the past. At least one of our questioners has thrown questions that I just can't answer, and I have to go do my homework. But I enjoy that process too. Andy, do you have anything that you might add?
Well, some of these questions are so good that it's almost like the proper response is just to say, yeah, good point.
And grin.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would love to see NIST answer to some of these. It's very difficult to get them to answer to anything. We're still waiting on the request for correction, but these certainly should be published, and we will do that. Now, this might be a good question. Perhaps this is a silly question, they say, but why didn't the explosion from the aircraft detonate the demolition charges in the Twin Towers?
Okay. Next week on Thursday at 1 o'clock Pacific, we will start our live webinar on the Twin Towers. And the answer to this question and the question itself might make more sense at that time. Well, I wouldn't want to speculate why the aircraft didn't set off explosions. Perhaps it did. There's massive explosions of jet fuel when the aircraft hits. So who knows? Maybe many of them did go off along with the aircraft. Maybe, and they're not all tied together. It wouldn't necessarily destroy the sequence of explosives just because the aircraft hit a few of the explosions. Also, they wouldn't be wired all together. They would be independently and wireless, which would be a lot more expensive. But apparently they had a big budget for this false flag operation, which is obviously what 9/11 was. We might get into that a little more next week. So maybe you have something else, a thought on that one, Andy.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, you could disturb a few of them, I believe, without disturbing the entire bunch. Without, you could still bring down the towers even if something was displaced. And we don't know what was going on with the planes and how those were being controlled as well. So it's a very good question, but I think the evidence itself and the physical evidence shows that these were controlled demolitions. In the case of the Twin Towers, the very simplest way to look at it is top block of a building can't crush the lower part without slowing down. When you establish that, I would love to get the perpetrators in front of a jury or in front of a congressional committee and have them lay out exactly how this was done, like the end of some kind of mystery movie, so we could get the full details and put it in the history books. And maybe they could answer that question as well, or possibly this next one here. Do you have any guesses as to where the command post would have been to detonate? Inside the World Trade Center 7 bunker? I'm assuming this was done wirelessly.
Yeah, I agree with the wireless guess. It's just, it would be a lot more clean, and you wouldn't have to run hundreds of miles of wires throughout the building. It'd just be a lot easier to do in an occupied building for these perpetrators. Where it was run from, well, interesting that Building 7 housed the command bunker on the 23rd floor, which was an emergency operations center that Giuliani had put in that building. And interestingly enough, it does face the Twin Towers. And so perhaps, we don't know where this operation was run from, but it could have been run from the 23rd floor bunker. We have the building being evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down, Building 7 was evacuated. We talked about Barry Jennings and Michael Hess's experience trying to get up to the 23rd floor, where they were expecting to serve from as emergency operators themselves. And then they were almost blown up inside the building on the way back down. So perhaps it was actually run from there. We don't know. And perhaps one of the reasons for the destruction of Building 7 could have been to destroy that very operation thoroughly, as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was on the 12th and 13th floor, where the worst fires in the building were before this building came down. The Securities and Exchange Commission lost thousands of files related to hundreds of very high-profile cases that it was pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. So those cases were canceled after that. So anyway, we don't know. Andy, you want to speculate any further?
Well, when you're talking wirelessly, that could be anywhere from any of those buildings, or maybe out in the street or somewhere. And who's looking in the midst of 9/11? I mean, obviously people are concerned about their safety, and that's all they're looking for. So, or that's all they're caring about. So they're not looking for whoever's actually pushing the button to bring down World Trade Center 7. So unfortunately, that's not something we can answer until we have a real investigation that gets the players in front of a questioning body and gets them to confess, and then we can get some of those details.
Right on. Well, thank you. That's it for the questions today?
Yes, it is.
All right. Keep them coming, guys. Great job on those questions. This was part 1 of 9/11, An Architect's Guide, World Trade Center Building 7. As I mentioned, next Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific, we'll jump into part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, which will be looking at the actual explosions, witnesses of explosions, hundreds of them, sudden near freefall collapses, high velocity lateral ejections, shattering of the structural steel frame, the midair pulverization of the concrete. Very, very incredible evidence that has convinced millions of people, along with the extreme heat, which is 2 weeks from today. High-rise fires, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron. We go into much more detail than we're able to go into today on the iron microspheres, the thermite, and the nanothermite. So I encourage everybody to come back, and we'll get a notice out too and let you know. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank Andy, and thank you, our audience, and all the people who helped us put this presentation together. We'll catch up with you next week. Bye for now.